This is part 3 of Unit M and N. This part will cover the neuroendocrine connection, which is the connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Remembering, nervous system comprised of the central nervous system and the peripheral, which was covered in part 2. So let's get started. So the glands that we need to be aware of, and this is a good little diagram, the hypothalamus, we remember, is the part of the brain center for homeostasis that controls the pituitary gland. There's going to be two parts, the anterior, which sits closer to the nose side of the body, and the posterior sitting closer right back, facing back. The thyroid gland, which we talked about, the one that makes thyroxine, the adrenal glands, the one that makes adrenaline, pancreas, we talked about previously in the digestive unit, making insulin and glucagon, then the ovaries and the testes in the male, the ones that we will discuss in our last unit, Unit P, reproduction. So the hypothalamus is part of the brain. So it is not technically a gland, it is nervous tissue. However, it also does make hormones. So we call this neurosecretory. Because although it is nervous tissue, it has the ability to make and secrete hormones. It is going to control 100% the pituitary gland. And here we see the two dangles. So this would be the anterior, and depending on which way the man in the diagram is facing, so we'd have to be careful, the anterior towards the nose, the posterior near facing butt end, right? The back of the head. So in this diagram, we remember the hypothalamus lies right on top of it, and it's going to control the anterior and the posterior gland in two very different ways. And we need to understand and know the two different ways that these glands are controlled. Let's examine the anterior first. So the anterior, and in this diagram, the man is flipped, so his nose would be on this side of the page. The hypothalamus is going to control the anterior by releasing what are known as trophic hormones, or releasing hormones. So in the example we're going to talk about today, TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, would be an example. The hypothalamus will release these hormones, and they will travel through the bloodstream into the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary makes their own hormones. So they are controlled by hormones that the hypothalamus makes and releases into the bloodstream that tells the anterior pituitary to release the hormones that it synthesizes for its very own self. Different relationship, hypothalamus with the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary does not make its own. It releases hormones that the hypothalamus, so neurons, neurosecretory cells that synthesize hormones that travel down these green vessels, nerves, and are released into the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary then would release these hormones into the blood. So anterior pituitary makes its own, but is controlled through releasing hormones. Posterior pituitary does not make its own. It makes, the hypothalamus makes the hormones for the posterior pituitary. So hormones, remember, are chemical messengers that travel in the bloodstream. They travel in the bloodstream, and they would bind to receptors on the surface of the cell. So remember back to proteins, cell proteins. They would bind to certain areas of the cell, and then they would cause a certain reaction. So they're traveling in the blood, and then they're going to bind to a cell, the target cell. The hormones that we need to know for this course, today we're not going to learn all of these, but eventually we will know these. So the posterior pituitary releasing oxytocin. I'm just going to mention them. ADH, we don't need to know them yet. TSH, we do need to know. That's one that we are going to look at today. FSH and LH is going to be in the reproductive growth hormone. we can just have heard it. We don't need to know specifically, and we will not talk about these. So what will become confusing is to be absolutely certain about the fact that the posterior pituitary releases these two, the anterior pituitary releases these ones. Okay, so an example that we need to know in this unit, we need to start to understand, to think about, again, the idea of homeostasis. If that image of a man standing on a ball on a board and trying to balance, right, helps, this is an example. So a negative feedback loop, our heating systems, our cooling systems work this way. So what happens is the room will get warmer. The air conditioner turns on. The thermostat would be like the brain, right, in this analogy, and this would be like the body. When then the air conditioner, the body, has caused the change, the desired change to occur, this is going to feed back to the thermostat and say, hey, the room has cooled down now, and this will shut off the thermostat. So this is a cycle that is going to allow for maintain homeostasis. So we get a bit out of balance, and the brain tells the body to get back into balance. When we're back in balance, then the brain shuts off, sending the message. The example that we're going to examine, so this is a fabulous example because it is an example that we've examined, or this hormone we've talked about in other units. So let's just walk it through this negative feedback loop. The hypothalamus, remember, is part of the brain. It is not a gland. The pituitary, and in this case we're talking anterior pituitary, is controlled by the hypothalamus through releasing hormones. So TRH stands for thyroid releasing hormones. Our hormone, the hypothalamus releases this hormone into the bloodstream. It travels and it causes the pituitary gland to release another hormone, TSH, which stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone, and we do not need to know the full names. This will stimulate the thyroid gland, the butterfly-shaped gland that sits on our trachea. Remember, the one that uses the active transport of iodine to make thyroxine, thyroxine being the hormone that regulates the metabolic rate of all our cells, increasing the uptake of oxygen and glucose. This then is going to cause this gland to release thyroxine. When thyroxine gets released, this has a negative feedback effect on the brain. So making thyroxine will shut off the brain from making and releasing more TRH. It will shut off the ant pit from releasing more TSH. This is a negative feedback loop. When all the thyroxine gets used up, then this cycle would begin again. The hypothalamus releasing TRH, traveling to cause the anterior pituitary gland to make and release TSH, causing again the thyroid gland to make thyroxine. A negative feedback loop, very important. So the key ideas we covered in this about 8 minutes, little screencast, the connection between the nervous system, the hypothalamus, and the endocrine, the master gland, the pituitary gland. The master gland is referred to as the pituitary. There is the anterior on the front side and the posterior. We want to make sure we understand the difference between the relationship between the hypothalamus and the anterior and the hypothalamus and the posterior. Stop now and recall. Can you remember? The hypothalamus releasing hormones. The example we looked at today, TRH. The hypothalamus makes hormones for the posterior to release. A negative feedback loop. Use the example of thyroxine. Hope that helped.